Hi everyone, my name is Srishti Jayant Deshmukh. In this segment, we would now be moving on to understand my thought procedure for General Studies Paper 4. Talking about GS4, GS4 is that paper which is very different from other subjects. We read the newspaper, we read the entire material for General Studies, we read our optionals, but GS4 is different in itself, because GS4 has an entire different subject perspective. We talk about the ethical perspectives that are required for a civil servant to have, and in the second part of the paper we have case studies also. So I'll just take you through my approach in this entire paper while I was attempting it. Coming to the first question, state the three basic values universal in nature in the context of civil services and bring out their importance. So the question has, I would say, two parts. First is about stating the three values and note the word universal. So it's more about universal in nature, not a very specific value but universal value. And in this context you have to bring out the importance also. So it's a very straightforward 10 marker. I attempted the paper in the serial order as the questions were. And since the ethics paper is said to be a little bit lengthy, it's always good to just start writing and keep a tab on the time. That is equally important. So in this question I think I noted three basic values. The first value I talked about was integrity. So I explained what was it, just tried to define it somehow, and then I tried to bring out its importance in the civil service context. So I used an example that how integrity is very important, because there's a lot of decision making power. So it's important not only integrity of in case of power, but since you have to deal with money also, integrity is extremely important. And the second value that I talked about was compassion. I always felt, and even now I feel, that compassion is a value which is there in the civil service. Then a very fundamental change could be there. So this was the second value that I quoted. And I tried to explain what is it when you feel about some other person, when you're sensitive about other person's feelings. And then I tried to say ki, this in the society there are many marginalized sections, and there could be people or cases which are very peculiar. So in those cases it is good to be compassionate. If you have that value, then maybe our way of approaching that particular person and case would be different. And the third thing that I think I have quoted is discipline. See, this is a very general question, so you can have your own views on it. Whatever basic value that came to my mind in that moment, I just quoted, and I explained how it is important for a civil servant. Moving on to the next question. What is meant by public interest? So just a moment, I'll move on, I missed on this one. So this part B of question number 1. Distinguish between code of ethics and code of conduct with suitable examples. See, examples in general we are quoting in the ethics paper in every answer. But when it is explicitly mentioned examples, then it's very important for us to give an example and substantiate our point. And we have to distinguish between code of ethics and the code of conduct. So what came to my mind at that moment was, code of ethics is a broad vision. It's like an aspirational vision which is given to any organization in general, and it has certain values and principles which are to promote a particular person into into working in a particular style. So code of ethics is about those values, the principles which promote ethical behavior in general. And then I moved on to code of conduct. So for the code of ethics, I said that we could have code of ethics for a doctor, which it is an overall vision that how he should be doing his day-to-day duties. The fact that the life of a patient is very important, and it is something that he has to work towards saving and towards using all his capabilities to cure the person and save the person from dying. So I think that is a code of ethics, that example I used. And then I moved to the code of conduct. Now when I was thinking about code of conduct, I was just reminded of the All India Service Conduct Rules which we have in the All India Services. So code of conduct could be a specific directions, kind of guidelines that are given, which are broadly based on code of ethics, but they are specific guidelines, and they are actually concerned with your actions. And since this, and they actually deter you from involving yourself from activities like bribery and how to manage the conflict of interest. These specificities are mentioned in the code of conduct. Conduct is behavior, action. So for the example, I quoted the All India Service Rules, that conduct rules how that an employee is a government employee, an All India Service employee. If he might be prosecuted if he's having any person who is any child who's working at his home as a child labor, and also taking dowry. That also is something which can come in under the All India Service Conduct Rules. So some examples I quoted from our example itself. Moving on to question number 2, part A. What is meant by public interest, and what are the principles and procedure to be followed by the civil servants in public interest? So this question again has 2 parts. It is a 150-word answer. What is meant by public interest? So in the introduction part of this answer, since it's a 150 words, you don't have to I didn't go for very deep introduction or very good background. Very briefly I defined what is public interest. Interest where the desire, wants and needs of the government or of the public, of the citizens is followed properly and it's catered to properly. Any action taken in that regard could be public interest. So a very generalistic definition that I could form at that moment. I introduced my answer with that. Moving on to the second part, and which is also the major part of the answer, I felt. What are the principles and procedures to be followed? So I noted the 2 words, principles and procedures. In principles to be followed, I started with the principle of public integrity. I always connected public integrity with public interest. And when you talk of public integrity, I connected it with not involving oneself in dishonest activities like bribery and corruption, etc. Then upholding rule of law. That is something I quoted later. In principle, another 1-2 principles that I quoted there was principle of emotional intelligence also. Because if you are working in public interest, then somewhere down the line emotional intelligence could help you out to greater reach the idea of public interest. And one principle which I really remember at that moment was that the rules should not become ends in themselves. Many times it happens that a person, a civil servant is just following his rules, and in that while following rules, the real aim of public service delivery, that gets defeated. So that should not happen. So that I wrote that rules should not become ends in themselves. They should only be used for public service, for effective public service delivery. And procedure to be followed. So talking about procedure, I felt whenever you have to implement something in public interest, procedure is nothing but the rules and regulations. So proper rules and regulations need to be followed, and rule of law needs to be there. So this is something that I had in mind and I concluded suitably. Moving on to part B of question number 2. The Right to Information Act is not all about citizens' empowerment alone. It essentially redefines the concept of accountability. Discuss. So this is a full-fledged question and it's just in 150 words. You have to sum up a lot of points. My mind was coming up with a lot of things here. I'll just tell you. In the introduction, I tried to explain what exactly is RTI. So I opened up with writing some of the provisions of this Right to Information Act. So just as to provide a brief background of the further argument. Here it's given, it's not just about citizens' empowerment alone, it's also redefining the concept of accountability. So redefining the concept of accountability, I feel first I need to also talk a little bit about accountability. So what I did, I started with RTI and then I moved down to understand what was accountability. Answerability for a particular work of yours. So I tried to define it suitably in 1 or 2 lines, and then I moved on how it has redefined. And some points which I felt were important in this context, was the information per se is important, okay, but the information being in public domain is also important, because the citizens will have access to that information and there will be no information asymmetry. I really had this word in my mind kicking. Information asymmetry could be controlled, and when information asymmetry is controlled, then better accountability can be ensured. The distance between the government and the citizen could be reduced. So those were the things which I wrote in the second part of this answer. Moving on to question number 3, part A. What is meant by conflict of interest? Illustrate with examples the difference between actual and potential conflict of interest. This was a very interesting question. So I started with actually, since it's asked what is meant. See, I felt what is meant means they don't want a very hardcore definition. They just want to understand what do you mean by conflict of interest. So I explained it in my own words that when there could be a conflict between a personal interest and a public official interest, then a conflict of interest might arise. In a little bit of paragraph, I think 4 to 5 lines, I tried to open up this concept of conflict of interest. And then the major part of the answer was again divided into 2 subparts, illustrating the difference between actual and potential conflict of interest. So one example that I could make up, examples are something that I think we should be working on at our home itself, because conflict of interest is something really general. It could be asked, it's mentioned in the syllabus also. So potential conflict of interest means I felt I gave an example that if a lady or a person who is a government employee, he might be getting a chance to work as an election officer in a particular area, but he is in a position that he has to decide and say yes or whether or not he'll continue to work in that area. Now the personal position is that he has his own younger brother who's contesting for the election in that particular area. So if he gets the charge of that, then it is a potential conflict of interest. If he gets a charge, then it's a potential conflict of interest that some allegations could come that he's favoring his brother. So this is a potential conflict of interest I felt here. And then for actual conflict of interest, I used another example that kind of a conflict of interest between your personal end and your public end. For example, a lady is in charge of the admissions, and she's an officer or a teacher in a college, and she's also entrusted with the admission, and her daughter herself wants to get an admission. So and then if she is actually signing on that document that yes, she'll be getting admission on some basis which are not clear, then it's actual conflict of interest, and that needs to be taken care of. I think when we talk about conflict of interest in the introduction, then I also mentioned a little bit of difference between what is actual and what is a potential, and then I substantiated it with examples. Coming to part B, now this is a quotation. In looking for a people to hire, you look for 3 qualities: integrity, intelligence and energy. And if they do not have the first, the other 2 will kill you. That's what Warren Buffett said. The question is, what do you understand by this statement in the present day scenario, and explain. Okay, so I felt okay, this is a question where a quote is being given to you and you have to explain it in your own words in the present context. I noted the term present day scenario. What do you understand in present day scenario? So what I felt, hiring and entrepreneurship and all of this employment is something very much in news right now. But here the focus of the question is on 3 words: integrity, intelligence and energy. Then I tried to explain that while a person is being hired as a part of a company, these 3 qualities are important. But I tried to conceptualize how having the third one only and not having the other 2 can ruin the organization. Then I substantiated. For example, if a person has immense energy and he has a lot of hunger to climb up the steps or the ladder of the organization's hierarchy, then in that case he will take some dishonest means to do it. He might involve himself into a bribery, or maybe he might involve himself into nepotism or corruption. I was also reminded of sexual harassment at workplace, and I felt that maybe if a person does not have integrity and he says a lot of things like he's a lot of intelligence, he's having energy. If he doesn't have integrity, then he may involve himself in certain activities like that. For example, asking favors, asking sexual favors, that's one part of the organization. So I just tried to open up different examples of how not having integrity but having intelligence and energy could ruin the organization and the person in general, not only the person who's hiring but also the organization in general. Moving to question number 4, part A. In doing a good thing, everything is permitted, which is not prohibited expressly or by clear implication. Examine this statement with suitable examples in the context of public servant discharging his or her duties. See, this question appears to be very convoluted. It has a lot of layers. So I read it again 2 or 3 times. I had to read this question in order to get a sense of what's being asked. In doing a good thing, everything is permitted. Note the word everything is permitted, which is not prohibited. So you can do anything but not the thing which is expressly prohibited. Okay, and what we had to do is to examine this statement. The word examine means that you have to find out, you have to either agree with this statement also and disagree, both positive as well as negative. Those 2 dimensions need to be covered in this answer. So examine the statement with suitable examples in the context of a public servant discharging the duties. So I feel that in the positive of it, that in doing a good thing, everything is permitted. So I was just reminded of the example of compassion. We often quote this example that if a poor lady who's a widow from a very poor caste is coming to you and asking for a pension card or a PDS card, ration card, then either you can reject her plea saying that you don't have the required number of documents, or you go an extra mile and be compassionate enough, be emotional intelligent and do her work. So here it is being positively used, that everything is permitted means you can somehow help the woman to get those certificates and those benefits, and somehow you can also give her some time, that okay, we're giving you these many time, even if that's not explicitly allowed by the law. So it's not prohibited, but you're doing it for the sake of public interest. That I felt is a positive one for this line. But since examine is given, a negative example also had to be given, and so I gave the example of how for giving any particular duty, it is not prohibited to extend the time. It is not prohibited. Generally, we don't have really stiff, stern timeline to do the work. So generally, civil servants or public servants might involve themselves in being lazy and pushing the files like that, not looking into them. So I felt that was a moment where negatively this point could be taken, and that example I took, that public servants keep pushing the files and be lazy and keep pushing their work on each other. That is not expressly prohibited, but it is impacting the efficiency and productivity of the work of that department. And that is how I opened up the 2 dimensions of the issue. Examine में talking about both one example of positively how the statement can be taken of compassion and going an extra mile for that lady, even if it is expressly not prohibited, and negatively in the case where they push files, push cases against each other, and not against but for each other. They say that I am not doing this work, that person will do it. This is like pushing files, increasing the time. So this is not expressly prohibited, but this has a negative impact. So these 2 dimensions I covered. Moving on to part B with regard to morality of actions. One view is that means are of paramount importance, and the other view is that ends justify the means. Which view do you think is more appropriate, and justify your answer? See, in this question, you don't have to really work on both the aspects equally, because they're asking you your view. And a means ends debate, this is something which we read in ethics a lot, means and end. So I personally utilized the argument of Gandhiji that means are equally important for reaching the end. If you're only considering about the end, then you may end up using such means which are completely defeating the end purpose. So I went with that means are important, but I also tried to justify it by quoting Gandhiji, quoting some examples like how he utilized a path of non-violence satyagraha, and he knew that his path was equally important as the freedom of the country, and how those ethos have continued to be vibrant in today's country, India. Even today we utilize that particular political satyagraha and non-violence today, because Gandhiji had established very clearly that non-violence is the only path and means is equally important. So I think for the sustainable purpose, I use that word sustainable thing, for that means are important. But at the end I also wrote that ends are also something which we should have in mind. It is not that we completely focus on means and end is defeated. Moving on next to question number 5, part A. Suppose the government of India is thinking of constructing a dam in a mountain valley bound by forests and inhabited by ethnic communities. What rational policy should it resort to in dealing with unforeseen contingencies? See, this question is an applied question. This is kind of a debate which we study in environment versus development. Yes, so this debate is something which we keep on studying even in General Studies paper 3, but here it is asked in the context of paper 4. So what was coming to my mind is there are two things to be done. You have to construct a dam in a mountain valley, but there are ethnic communities, know the term ethnic communities, who are inhabiting those areas. So what a rational policy means, I thought that the word rational here would mean a more balanced policy that takes care of the interests of both the development as well as the environmental aspects. Environment here I also discussed about displacement, environmental damage, displacement, and culture of the ethnic community or life of the ethnic community. I felt these are some things which are just coming. Here I talked about energy. So I developed my argument, my rational policy based on these things in my mind, that adequate rehabilitation and resettlement program should be there for the ethnic communities. I opened the answer with the fact that first there has to be a reassessment of whether or not that particular mountain valley is the only one which is there for is the only one which is there for development. So the first option is, let's just find out कि यहाँ पे ही करना पड़ेगा क्या, can we change the location? That was the first point. But then I also said that if it is compulsory that you have to work on the dam in that particular area, then you can move on with such that the design of the dam should be such that it should not harm the environment. Then adequate rehabilitation, resettlement procedures for the ethnic communities, and ethnic communities should be brought on board. Ethnic communities, there could be a provision, I added one provision that allowed the ethnic community population to participate in the construction of dam, so that they are getting money for the labor work, and they feel that the dam which we are constructing, they are a part of that, and they are able to utilize the water and energy which will be generated from the dam. At the end of this answer, I just drew kind of a balance. So I had actually decided this in advance at my home, that if I face a question on balance between two things, then I will be drawing it, and I felt this is that answer where I could use this particular diagram. So I ended up balancing. I wrote different things that the very things that I have mentioned here, I mentioned it here in the balance, just to graphically represent my answer and to make it much more presentable. I just tried to make a kind of a balance here. Maybe it might have fetched for me a half mark more. Then moving on to B part, explain the process of resolving ethical dilemmas in public administration. Note the word explain the process of resolving ethical dilemmas in public administration. You know what came to my mind when I read this question? I felt this question is asking you nothing but the theory of solving a case study, because a case study is a dilemma, and it's a dilemma in public administration. So here they are trying to understand the process of resolving. So maybe the theoretical part and the practical part of it. So I just asked myself, if I get a case study, how do I solve it? And whatever framework that I had in my mind, I said I'll just use it here. So I started by saying that we'd first look into the ethical dilemma. We'd first find out what is the conflict of interest between, what are the two issues that need to be looked into, then what are the stakeholders involved, other people, whether they are children, women, whether they are poor, whether any person is a DM, STM, or a police officer or a doctor, what are the important people involved in this case. And then I also wrote that we could develop multiple options in order to find out the pros and cons of each option. So while I was answering this question, I just asked myself, how do I solve a case study? I first open up with the ethical dilemma, then I move on to tell them the stakeholders, then I move on to developing the options. So here I just explained it, how we would do it, to develop the options, then we'll analyze the pros and cons of each option, how it is positive, how it is negative, and then you suitably come to a conclusion by keeping in mind the rule of law, your duty of integrity and compassion. All of these things are something which you think, and then you justify your solution. So that is how I felt that this answer could be written, and I wrote it suitably. Moving on to question number 6, that is the last question of part A. So part A is the true rule, and this is a quote by Abraham Lincoln. The true rule in determining to embrace or reject anything is not whether it has any evil in it, but whether it has more evil than good. There are few things wholly evil. There are few things wholly evil or wholly good. Almost everything, especially of a government policy, is an inseparable compound of the two, so that our best judgment of the preponderance between them is continually demanded. See, Abraham Lincoln's language appears to be complex at the first, but I felt that the issue here is very simple. The issue is, he's trying to say that in general, in public administration, the issues which a person is going to get are going to be gray areas. We say reality is not black and white, we are having gray areas. That means you won't be wholly having things that are wholly evil and wholly good. Like killing a person, wholly evil maybe, for no reason. If you're killing a person, it's wholly evil, or wholly good to help out a person. But in public administration, the dilemma that will have in decision making is going to be in decision which are going to be having partly evil and partly good. So it's about finding which is having less of evil and more of good. So I first tried to, in this quote, see, in this paper we got a lot of quotations, and we had to actually explain them. So reading the quotation, I started by, in this particular question, I started by opening the issue. When the quotation is given, you see, here it was about more good and less evil. This is where the decision making had to happen predominantly. So I felt that in a quote, when anybody says something, he's saying in a very particular context or a paragraph. But if we have to explain it, then we have to first delineate what is the core issue being talked about by the person, by the personality. So I opened up the answer by what is it all about, and then I started to substantiate it. And for example, in public administration, you have to take a decision. For example, you have to take a case is there, and you have to ensure that more evil does not happen, good should happen. And there are two parties. One party is poor, the other is also middle class, and you have to sort of conciliate them or solve the case. Then you have to take that path where more evil does not happen, more good happens. So I just, whatever came to my mind in those moments, I tried to develop some examples to substantiate my argument, around 2 examples to substantiate my argument, because it's a 150 words here, so you have to hurry also. 2 examples to substantiate this, that this is the most amount of dilemma that a person would face in public administration. Moving on to the second B part, anger and intolerance are the enemies of correct understanding, Mahatma Gandhi. See, the quotations of Gandhiji are something that we should be reading always, because Gandhiji, as a person, is the father of the nation, extremely important for us. So his quote is, anger and intolerance are the enemies of correct understanding. I just noted down the keywords: anger, intolerance, and third is understanding. Correct understanding, mind you, correct understanding. So first I tried to explain in the first paragraph what Gandhiji might have meant, that in order to have a correct understanding, in order to have a clear picture, one should be free from anger and intolerance. And then I tried to open the fact that if a person is angry, then what negative can happen? If a person is angry, then he would be interpreting the other person's argument in a different manner, all of those things. If he is intolerant, then he will not respect other person's opinion. So I tried to explain why anger and intolerance can be a roadblocks in that. And while I was ending this answer, I also tried to substantiate by how Gandhiji promoted not being angry and intolerant. He promoted cross-cultural exchange between all the communities. For caste also, he worked a lot. He worked for the people of lower caste, calling them Harijan. So that positive aspect I ended my answer with, by giving that how one can control the anger and how one can reduce intolerance in amongst oneself, and that can help us to understand the reality in a better manner. Part C, falsehood takes the place of truth when it results in unblemished common good. See, this particular quote, honestly I was not being able to make correct sense of what is being said here. I read it twice and thrice, but I had to leave it half written. Then I came back to it again after the end. So at that moment I was just thinking, falsehood takes the place of truth. That the truth's place is taken by false, a false argument, when it results in unblemished common good. So it is a quote from Tirukkural, and he's trying to say that if a false thing is leading to common good, unblemished common good, then it will take the truth's position. So I just tried to somehow opened up the what could be false, how it could take the place of truth, and how in such a situation it is there when unblemished common good is being talked about. So I just tried to make up this answer. I was not really perfect to understand what is happening. I tried to weave some answer in one page, but honestly I was not able to write completely on it. There could be one question where you're unable to tackle it. So I left that for the part, and I came back to it again to substantiate or give some example where a truth was being substituted by falsehood, but it was accepted by everybody because it led to common good.